Asia is poised for growth, but with uncertainty in the US and Europe and its own structural problems to contend with, how has the outlook for Asia changed? Rajat Nag, who's the Managing Director for the Asian Development Bank, joins us on INSEAD Knowledge to tell us more. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Nag. Asia was fairly resilient when the financial crisis struck in 2008. How will it cope this time around with a wobbly US recovery and uncertainty in Europe?
Certainly be a bit more difficult because in 2008 there was much more fiscal space, and China of course could respond very aggressively with a huge fiscal stimulus. But having said that, I think Asia is coping reasonably well, and unless Europe and US go into a double dip, which we think is unlikely, I think Asia will cope reasonably well. There is a significant growth in private consumption and private investment, unlike government investment, which was the case in 2008. So we are forecasting that Asia will grow at a fairly healthy clip of about 7.5% this year and another 7.5% in 2012. It is down a bit from what we had forecast in April. We had forecast 7.8 at that time. So our overall assessment is that Asia will cope reasonably well, but on the assumption that the euro crisis has an orderly resolution and the world economy in the West does not get into a double dip recession.
At the time, the bank didn't expect a doomsday scenario of a wider financial crisis. Have you revised that view today?
Not yet. As a matter of fact, in the last week or so, one is seeing some positive signs coming out on the euro scene. So we're still hoping that there will be political leadership. I think it's a political rather than economic issue, and we're hoping that things will resolve. But we're keeping a close watch, but we haven't downgraded our estimates as yet.
What is keeping the EU from better coordinated economic action? Could a centralized financial institution other than the European Central Bank be effective?
You see, Europe has one central bank, but it has got each member state being responsible for its own fiscal policy. And therefore, it does make it difficult to coordinate on the fiscal side. And each country has different set of problems. So one can see why it's not as easy to coordinate. But I think the most recent crisis has driven home the point that there needs to be much better coordination on the fiscal side as well. And I think ECB, of course, will play an important role. But I don't think you need another institution as such. You just need to make sure that the politics of EU can work and work well.
What can Asia do to assist its counterparts?
Well, Asia, first of all, can help by importing from the West, which basically means consuming more. And this rebalancing of Asian consumption is already taking place. As you know, Asia really was a major and continues to be a major exporter to the US and the Europe. Asia needs to become more consumer Asia rather than only factory Asia. But this rebalancing will take time, and Asia cannot pick up the entire slack. But Asia can certainly help by consuming more, which means importing more from the Western economies.
How China manages its economic transition has been attributed as one of the key factors for Asia's continued growth. Where could China lose its momentum?
China is a major driver, not only just in Asia, but the world as a whole. We believe that there is still sufficient room in the Chinese economy for domestic consumption. But I think it is realistic to expect that China cannot continue to be the driver and sort of have the high rates of investments that they have of almost 50%. Chinese domestic consumption certainly will have to increase, but to what extent that will increase could be one factor. Inflation is another. I think the price pressures in China and indeed in other parts of Asia are certainly a factor. So at the moment, we do see China continuing on a fairly robust economic growth of over 9%. But I think one needs to watch how much pressures China itself may come. The Chinese export markets, which is essentially the US and Europe, are obviously not going to be as strong. So China will have to export more within the region. China will have to consume more within its own self. So at the moment, we do think there is space, but growth in Asia as a whole, including China, can get fragile depending on what happens to the rest of the world.
Inflation has been an ongoing problem for Asian economies, but with a global slump, policymakers will be caught in a balancing act between raising interest rates to fight price inflation and lowering rates to spur spending. So what's the best way forward?
It's a balancing act, as you said. I think there are some countries where the inflationary pressures are stronger than others. Vietnam, for example, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh. Even in India and in China, the inflationary pressures are high. But India has already been taking steps on the monetary policy side for quite a few quarters. China has maintained a fairly tight monetary policy stance. So I think authorities in Asia need to watch, because inflationary pressures certainly are a concern. And as a matter of fact, we expect overall in Asia, this is Asia ex-Japan, inflation to be about 5.8% this year, moderating somewhat next year to be still around 5, which is still fairly high. On the other hand, you've got to make sure that growth is not, cramped. The weaknesses in the Western economies could certainly cause that. So at the moment, we are urging a very cautious approach to make sure you don't choke off recovery, but you also want to make sure that inflationary pressures don't build up beyond a certain point. And I think the authorities have to look at their individual circumstances to do that.
The Asian Development Bank has noted the quality of employment as one of Asia's key structural problems. In 2008, the proportion of informal unemployment was at 67% in Asia, and this compared to the OECD, which was at 8.3%, and even Latin America at 33%. So what are the implications for growth?
No, I think that's a very serious issue. First of all, there is a significant amount of underemployment, which doesn't get captured in the official unemployment rates. Secondly, Asia has, of course, seen very significant growth, but that growth really needs to be job-creating growth and not jobless growth, and this is certainly of concern, particularly in countries which are young and therefore has a large and growing labor force. The second factor, which I think is very important for Asia, is the quality of the labor force, which really is a reflection of the quality of the education. We do have a large number of, let's say, engineering graduates coming out of engineering universities in Asia, but not all of them are well qualified by international standards, which then causes this sort of problem that you were mentioning. So I think the structural issues for Asia are twofold. One, you've got to create growth with jobs, but you also got to have skilled labor force and an improvement in the quality of education and the quality of the labor force to be able to participate in this growth process. So I think this is a major challenge that Asia faces.
So does it boil down to education?
Boils down to education, training, better vocational training, better match of skills with the demands. Because in Asia, there is quite rightly emphasis on education, but sometimes that tends to be quantity rather than quality. So I think we've got to focus on quality. Also in Asia, I think there's got to be much more focus and emphasis on vocational training, on skills for the economy's needs, rather than just sort of pursuing higher education for its own sake.
Despite positive growth forecasts, 63% of the world's poor live in Asia. Where's the income inequality most pronounced, and what's required to curb the widening gap?
This is one feature of Asia's growth which is very troubling, which is rising inequality as you see declining poverty. And rising inequality is a feature in almost all countries, some more than others. And we believe that the key to it, therefore, has to be inclusive growth. Growth by itself would not be enough. You would have to make sure that the growth is such that people particularly the bottom of the pyramid, can participate in and benefit from growth, which means they've got to be well skilled, well educated, and healthy. I mean, they've got to be well to be able to participate in the economic process.
Mr. Nag, thank you for joining us on INSEAD Knowledge.
Thank you.